Journaling specifically has allowed me to lead a more intentional life.
Like, I always have to have a notebook in front of me, but I lean on it even more so now than ever before.
I just wanted to draw something. What I felt that I could draw was just draw my own daily experiences.
If I could just do that, then I'll be happy, you know?
Okay, it's been a while. Let's see if I remember how to do all this stuff. Hi there, you found my channel. This is where I like to talk about marketing and consumption while also kind of hoping that my cat wanders into frame so that people will keep paying attention. She's over there right now. Do you want to say hi? This is important for engagement. Well, we'll just do one of these, huh? Want to say hi? Jean. Hey, Jean. You want to say hi? I've talked about a lot of different stuff on the channel, but in particular, I really enjoy talking about consumption communities. And consumption community is a term that I use to refer to communities that inherently involve marketing and or purchasing to a pretty significant degree. It might even be considered like an entry point, like you basically have to buy something in order to be a part or an active part of this community. The specific criteria are pretty subjective, of course, and it's just made up, you know, so feel free to argue, but I do feel that overall, certain kinds of communities inherently involve buying stuff and wanting to buy stuff and being made to want to buy stuff more than others. Consumption community is also not necessarily a negative term. I want to make that really clear before we go any further. I also think that there's a lot of good to be found in these communities. That's actually a big part of this video. And in general, I try to only talk about consumption communities that I have some kind of personal familiarity with, communities where I am currently involved or have been involved personally at some point in the past. Anyway, I have a separate video about this whole concept, and it's much more general and broad in its scope than this one is going to be, so you can take a look at that video if you're interested. The reason I'm returning to the idea again here is because I recently got myself swept back into yet another consumption community, specifically the stationery community, as I'm calling it anyway. And I kind of figured that reflecting on that experience in front of a camera might be a good way to revisit the consumption community topic and hopefully make other people feel less weird about finding themselves in a similar sort of situation. And there's plenty of criticism here, don't you worry about that. But there's also a lot of appreciation for what this community is and what it does, at least from my personal perspective. So let's go ahead and talk about stationery. Here's today's itinerary. First, I'm going to tell you my own story covering my initial attraction, or maybe a re-attraction, to stationery, right up until like where I'm at with it right now. Next, I will share some observations about the contemporary stationery community, both good and bad. The point is just to share some thoughts and start conversations, and who knows, you know, some of this might be useful to someone who's becoming interested in stationery for the first time or who's returning to it after many years. To close out then, I will try to make sense of all of this and draw some bigger conclusions about my own relationship with consumption communities and why I'm attracted to them, as well as trying to come to terms with the stationery stuff in particular. And by the way, even if stationery isn't really your thing, there's still a lot here for you, I think. For one, there are a lot of broader implications to all of this. That's why I'm doing it. But the stationery community is also unique in lots of different ways, so I think it's just kind of interesting in general, even if you're not personally involved. I also have a feeling that this is going to be a long video, but usually that just means I have a lot to say about something, and that is definitely the case here. Also, to prevent this video from only offering one person's perspective, I reached out to a few different creators who have in-depth, first-hand knowledge of this specific topic. So you'll be hearing bits of my interviews with them along the way. And of course, I am extremely grateful that these people took the time to share their opinions and that they're okay with me showing you those interview clips right here.
My name is Andrew, and I'm a freelance illustrator. My company name is DREWSCAPE. I've been doing it for about 20 years, working as a freelance illustrator. I used to work in advertising, and the stuff I do is picture books, a lot of illustrations for advertising, and recently quite a few comics.
My name is Allison, and I am the person behind Little Coco Studio. I mainly try to focus on conversational style videos that range from topics in the stationery community related to planning or journaling or anything about that. And then the other piece of it is, where possible, I like to layer in a component of mindfulness or health and wellness, which is just a topic that I'm really passionate about.
I'm Toby, or TobySketchLoose, as the moniker goes. I am an artist who uses like ink and watercolors, and it's in the name, but I have a loose style. I think I realized a few years ago that what I actually wanted to do was show other people they can do it, and then it can be fun. I always say that I'm selling the idea that it's all right to do it and have a bit of fun.
I'm Helena, and I'm the voice and hands behind Tiny Tiger Co. on YouTube. I share cozy and comforting videos about journaling and fountain pens, often laid with some sociological analyses that I often can't help but do as a business professor.
With that said, please don't take the inclusion of these interviews as blanket endorsement by these guests. I think one of the biggest reasons I wanted to reach out to different creators, and these people in particular, is because besides the fact that I felt they would have some really thoughtful contributions to make, is because I'm guessing that the people who watch my videos would also enjoy their work. So I highly recommend taking a look at their channels, at their work, if you haven't already. I've included links to their channels in the description box. I also like to hide some Easter eggs there sometimes too, so maybe check it out now and then, I don't know. And with that, I think we're finally ready to get started. Here's the stationery video. So, my history with stationery. I think I was predisposed to take on the stationery hobby. I liked reading books when I was a kid, and my go-to answer for any kind of career questions was that I wanted to write books. So I was a kid who liked reading and writing. It was pretty common to receive chapter books, notebooks, journals, or even those weird mini booklights as birthday or Christmas presents. And apparently those booklights didn't really save my eyesight in the end, so we got here. But those kinds of gifts definitely encouraged my growing interest, not just in reading and writing, but in the tools of reading and writing. Still, that doesn't mean that I connected with each and every item. For instance, every time I received some kind of diary or journal, I would initially try to commit to making daily entries, and that never really worked out. But something that really did click with me was just writing by hand. As a kid and a teenager, I wasn't paying attention to a lot of these specifics, like what kind of paper and pens I was using. At some point, I decided that Pilot G2s were the best pens in the world. I probably have one nearby. There you go. As for the paper, I have some really specific memories. My grandma worked as a secretary for a company called Consol Energy, which is a fossil fuel energy company. She would give us entire reams of blank letterhead from her office. So, in hindsight, I think the kinder assumption for me is that the letterhead was going out of date anyway, and they just needed to get rid of it, so she grabbed some. But it is also possible that she was kind of stealing supplies because she could. Probably wasn't that, but still kind of fun to think about. And for a number of years, I think that was pretty much the only paper I used. Another big spike in my stationery interest was the introduction of the Moleskine brand. I'm going to say Moleskine.
Moleskine.
The introduction of this brand into mainstream American culture. So I can't speak for other people, but for me, this introduction happened probably like in the late 2000s, and it was probably because of Barnes & Noble. We didn't really have independent bookstores where I lived, so when we actually got a Barnes & Noble at the closest mall, it was a really big deal to have a bookstore at all. So Barnes & Noble sold Moleskine notebooks, which presented themselves as high-quality notebooks that had been used by famous artists like Hemingway and Picasso, something that is predictably not really true. Here's a quick summary of my research. But I guess I should actually show, and this is not a Moleskine. This is. Revisiting this, it's kind of funny, and I still honestly think that Moleskines are, the paper feels lovely. Like, it really does feel great. It's an incredibly smooth paper, and it's a nice weight. However, it was funny to find that Moleskines are actually really bad for my notebook needs nowadays. I did some testing. We have some fountain pen ink, one of those Molotov water-based ink markers, Sumi ink, alcohol-based ink, oil-based stamp ink, and some watercolor, which I use quite a bit in my notebooks. And as you can see, but as you can see, it fails on most fronts in terms of the bleeding. Point of comparison, I have a different notebook here, and looking at the exact same types of inks, much better. Alcohol-based markers, by the way, you probably shouldn't be using in any kind of general purpose sketchbook or notebook. But this will be a theme as we go through the rest of the journey here. Being initially introduced to a brand that was trying to pose itself as, higher end was exciting at the time, but of course, as you learn more, naturally other options become available, and more importantly than finding some kind of like objective best in any given category, it's actually a lot of fun, and it can be really rewarding to find something that just specifically works for your needs. It's not about having the best, it's about having what works for you. Next up, I went off to college for creative writing, so it was kind of inevitable that I wound up with a bunch more notebooks and pens, and I was buying that stuff despite the fact that most of my actual writing work, the school work, was happening on my laptop. I think it was sophomore year of college that I also received my first nice pen. And by nice pen, I mean like a pen that cost more than $5. I still have that exact pen. It was a retro 1951 Tornado. I pulled it out like a week ago. I knew I wanted to show it in the video. And now I have no idea where it is. It actually writes really well, I think, at least for like the first 10 minutes of each ink cartridge. But back in the day, this pen did not write for very long at all before running out of ink. So what could have been a pretty rapid progression to other kinds of fancy pens stalled out. So post-pandemic, as we were all emerging from our bunkers, I got interested in fountain pens for reasons that I don't really remember, maybe because I realized that inexpensive fountain pens were a thing at all, and I think that a decent number of other people in stationery would agree that fountain pens are a common gateway drug into this community, though admittedly I think initial experiences can vary quite a bit.
When I first bought my first fountain pen, it was actually a Lamy, and I didn't like it. I used it, it got clogged, and I think I threw it away. There's one time I threw it against the wall because it just refused to flow. I hated fountain pens for a while.
I can't remember when I first started using fountain pens, but it was driven by, I think a fountain pen is romantic. You own it, you get to hold it and know it, because they all do act a bit differently. There's also the not throwing it away element, it's not a bit of plastic that goes in the bin.
My first fountain pen was this pen. This is a TWSBI Eco with a broad nib. If I had never purchased another fountain pen, and of course I did, I would have been fine with this, honestly. So after that point, I did pick up one or two other things along the way, but I definitely wasn't in love with any of that stuff. So once again, what could have quickly become, an intense hobby or kind of an obsession didn't really go there. But then came the real rabbit hole deep dive, which started up earlier this year in 2025. So based on my emails and browsing history, it looks like I got sucked back in around April or May of 2025. It's now early October when I am recording this. What changed back in spring is that I suddenly got really interested in doing line and wash. That's ink and watercolor drawings. It really clicked, to put it lightly. All of a sudden I was putting in like sometimes even 8 hours a day of drawing and watercolor painting. And basically that is not an experience that I've had with any other kind of creative work. I think I still have some of these here. I hope there's nothing too insane. I just started filling stuff up and whatever notebooks and stuff I could get my hands on, and thankfully I had a lot saved up from some of the experiences we just talked about. As you can see here, it started out with just ink washes. That's just when you dilute an ink from its original color to something much lighter. For quite a while that kept me entertained. But as I said, I switched over to watercolors, which had never quite been my thing at all. I was working out what supplies I actually did want to use, what I enjoyed using, and the whole time there was definitely an emphasis on affordability, since I was going through a lot of materials along the way just to see what I liked. So for one, I needed paper that could take a certain amount of water without tearing, and at the same time I needed ink, fountain pen ink, whatever, that didn't bleed through the paper, and that did not start to spill all over the place if I touched it with water. So these personal requirements really narrowed down the scope of what I could use. And I'll try to run through this kind of quickly just in case you're interested in getting involved with a similar type of drawing and painting for yourself. But I was doing lots of internet research. That's just my general inclination. I want to see what other people think, particularly hear from people who know a lot more about this stuff than I do. So there are things called like India inks and Sumi inks. This is a Sumi ink, not that expensive, but this and India ink, other types of drawing inks, are not at all meant to be used in a fountain pen. Just the ingredients can really clog things up, and it's kind of a pain to clean these out. So you usually want to go with specific types of ink, for a fountain pen. So I eventually picked up some of the very few safe for fountain pen inks that are also waterproof. This was easy enough to get online. This I ended up having to import, and I had to do a bunch of them to make the shipping worth it. But hooray, I finally found some waterproof inks that gave me some options that work just fine in fountain pens without any kind of issues that I've noticed. So I was on my way. I don't like using regular paintbrushes and palettes of watercolor paints. So the alternative that I arrived at was brush pens. It's kind of the same concept as a fountain pen, where you fill up a cartridge or a converter, and then it goes through a feed and comes out at a fairly moderate rate. And at first this was really exciting because I didn't have to worry about, I'm going to dip over here. I got to make sure it's the right consistency, and then I can actually use it. I had whatever it was mixed ahead of time, and then I could just draw or paint with it, and it was great, and I could just go and go and go. Like I said, I was drawing for really long stretches of time at first. It was just super convenient and fun, and it didn't bog things down. You didn't have a bunch of cleanup that you had to worry about when you were wrapping things up. These were a nice option for quite a while. They're also not too expensive. They're basically all plastic. The tips are usually nylon or some other artificial, kind of fiber thing. But it wasn't enough. These are very similar, honestly. They're basically just brush pens, but instead of a little tiny ink cartridge or converter, the whole body is a reservoir. So you can put just plain water in there, or like I'm doing here, throw in some colors, watercolors, or mixed inks, diluted ink washes, and they're ready to go. This was the exciting stage of the discovery or rediscovery of stationery for me. It was like, oh man, I didn't even know these tools were around. And look at that, I found things that fit my specific situation really, really well. In my opinion, everything that I've described so far had a very organic and very justifiable progression. I had a specific need at any given time, and I looked around for things that would address that need. And that's a really important distinction, I think, because what I'm about to describe is basically the polar opposite of that. Okay, so it's like, I don't know, May or June of 2025, and for the time being, my purchases were being driven really by curiosity and utility. I was looking for stuff that would help me do a thing I wanted to do, and my response to the stuff that I bought was based on how well that stuff helped me do the very specific thing. Very pragmatic. But then the internet kind of did its thing. The online targeted marketing systems, they did not see the stuff I was getting as art supplies really, and instead pushed me quickly towards stationery, which again, I wasn't uninterested in, but it was something I'd never fully committed to or really explored in that much depth. I was suddenly swimming in videos and banner ads relating to stationery, not art stuff. And this was definitely a turning point. So because of all that stuff I mentioned earlier, my childhood, my dreams, my interest in writing tools, I think that I was kind of a perfect mark for stationery marketing. I very quickly got caught up on stationery videos from companies and regular people alike. More on this later, but stationery content tends to be extremely pleasant and welcoming, and those traits made it really easy for me to just keep watching a bunch of stationery videos, especially in the background, which is honestly how I usually watch YouTube stuff. And of course, this was recorded. I've gone back through my YouTube search and watch history, and it shows me which stationery focused channels I landed on and really started watching a bunch of. Jet Pens was the very first, and Yoseka Stationery was second. That's important to note because these are both stationery businesses as opposed to just individual people talking about their interests. Jet Pens is a digital-first stationery and office supplies business, and for several years now it has invested heavily in content creation, and it really seems like that strategy has paid off. They also have some great write-ups and resources on their website, and I think those are just perfect for someone who's completely new to a certain type of item, someone who's returning to stationery after a long time, things like that. But that was really just the start, because I was quickly introduced to the YouTube channel of Yoseka Stationery. I think that they actually represent a really interesting foil to Jet Pens, specifically in the content creation space. So in short, Yoseka, as well as lots of other independent stationery stores, tend to make videos that feel smaller and more personal compared to those of the bigger sites and retailers. And I love that pace. I loved that personal touch. I started watching a lot of videos from Yoseka because those videos to me felt much, much closer to the kinds of videos that I would see from independent creators. And just inherently, stationery feels like the kind of product category that is meant to be more personal and small scale. So of course that's ultimately an illusion, I think, in a way, because stationery is pretty big business, but I still associate it with old-fashioned people wearing corsets and writing letters to their erstwhile sweethearts. And come to think of it, that might still be an accurate representation of like a not insignificant portion of the stationery community. Now, for someone of my persuasion, it was kind of difficult to come to terms with the fact that I was spending so much time voluntarily consuming what is literally marketing content from stationery businesses. But again, that general vibe of the stationery videos kept me coming back. Yes, it's marketing, and yes, we're aware of that. I'm not saying that anyone's trying to trick viewers into thinking that it's something it's not, but there was enough there of value. There was enough there that didn't feel like marketing to keep me coming back. As for the effects of watching all the stationery content, you can probably guess what happened next. I bought a lot of stationery. Actually, I shouldn't say that in the past tense, because I continue to buy a lot of stationery. Specifically, I think it's a pretty formidable combination when you're being exposed to a lot of impressive and inspirational work online, while you're also feeling highly motivated to advance your own work?
I'll often look to start buying things if I'm just not content with what's happening. It's like a procrastination almost to make better art by avoiding the problem or thinking there's another solution. What I try and do is, just tell myself, is this really going to help the problem or not? But it's still hard not sometimes to just be there like a couple of hours comparing different things and then buying none of them and doing the same thing again tomorrow. And it can be quite painful. It can actually genuinely be, I think, quite emotionally like, it was stressful maybe. I'm probably generalizing too much. It feels like a thing which, if I talk to anyone, they know that feeling. I think it's quite a common thing. And I think because we judge ourselves so much, the easy solution is to go, right, well, it must be that I'm using the wrong things.
I'm the kind of overspender who tends to avoid the big, large singular purchases, but who feels totally fine about making lots of smaller purchases, even if those smaller purchases add up to the same cost of one really big purchase. And by the way, I was interested to hear from Andrew kind of a theory that I related to about how he'd become accustomed to those tiny little purchases or tiny little gifts when going out on a shopping trip.
When I was really young, I think that is part of a training that my parents kind of trained me to like. Because when I went to the mall with my mom, when I was small, she would always say, oh, you can pick something small. When I was an adult, every time I would visit an art store, I'll tell myself, okay, I'll just go home with something small. And therefore I have drawers overflowing with all kinds of brushes.
And this is important to note because stationery in particular has tons of small purchases to offer, or maybe I should say deceptively small purchases. $8 for a ballpoint pen is actually pretty expensive for that specific product, but at the same time, my buying brain sees that price and says, well, it's still just $8. If you spend any amount of time on a stationery website or you find yourself in an actual stationery store, you will see just how quickly these inexpensive items in isolation add up to a pretty big purchase. As a result, there have been quite a few times where I've received a stationery order in the mail and I felt just immediately disappointed. And I wasn't disappointed by the actual products themselves, but just by how small and insignificant my order looked, despite the price being kind of significant. And even that sense of disappointment is important for me to talk about, because usually when I feel that after I've bought something, I have some buyer's remorse, I think it can lead to one of two things. Either it makes me want to just stop buying that kind of product altogether, or it makes me want to buy more of that product, specifically stuff that feels like it offers better value, that will be more satisfying to have in hand or spend a certain amount of money on. And I think you can guess which of these two I ended up going with. So that combined with another important and really noticeable aspect of modern stationery, which is the high level of visual appeal. The most popular and successful stationery brands are extremely good at branding and product design. I mean, tastes differ, but I think that these companies do a great job of appealing to people who want their supplies to be pleasant to look at, and that's a pretty big category of people. And I know for a fact that I am not the only person out there who is a sucker for how something looks. A case study that I'd like to use here is pencil cases. So, sorting through the stationery websites, the look and design of certain pencil cases really attracted me. And because I had a bunch of drawing tools that I needed to organize and carry around, it was incredibly easy to give myself the okay to buy multiple pencil cases. Long story short, that's the front. I now have, let's see here, do we have room? Well, in the script I wrote 6 or 7, but there's 6 right here, 7, and I'm looking at least 2 more that I can't grab right now. Despite the fact that most of these are actually filled up with different kinds of things, I do know I promise I know that I don't need this many pencil cases, and I would still argue that I've never found like the perfect pencil case, but I have made a lot of progress, again, finding cases that work well for what I do, for what I actually need them for. And while I wish I could say that function was the only reason that I kept looking for and buying new pencil cases, it's just not true.
And honestly, I was kind of grateful to hear from my guest that I'm not alone in the experience of rushing into a new hobby.
Because I struggle with impulsive behavior, I do have ADHD, and I do get really, tend to hyper-focus with my hobbies. And so I have struggled with falling in love with a hobby. And then 10 days later, I've got like everything under the sun related to it.
At one time, I was buying fountain pens quite crazily, as in like sometimes every few months I'll buy one. Or within a year, maybe I could buy up to 10 fountain pens. And some pens could be really up to $100. But I realized there is a kind of a plateau. After a while, I realized that I had bought all the kinds of fountain pens that I wanted.
And importantly here, I was motivated by the desire to have another delivery to look forward to. Kind of embarrassing to admit, but it's absolutely true. So in other words, I was buying stuff for the sake of buying it, and that's definitely heading into negative territory when it comes to spending. So, soon after all of this, I hit the peak of my recent stationery obsession. So just for reference, my reintroduction to stationery was back in May, and the peak was basically mid-July. I was feeling burned out from work for other reasons, and I took a day trip up to Santa Barbara, just a really nice California coastal town. Highly recommend it if you're in the area. Naturally, I was looking around at some shops. When I saw that there was at least one stationery store nearby, I knew I had to visit. So this was a unique shopping experience. It was kind of like when you finally go to see a band that you've been obsessing over since you were a kid. I felt like I was the guy in the audience wearing the official t-shirt, sharing fun facts with the strangers around me without them asking. It was just me and one staff member in the store, which is usually not a very comfortable situation for me. I don't know how long I'm allowed to look at stuff before I start to seem suspicious. Should I make sounds of approval or thinking under my breath? But surprisingly, it was actually great. It was a fun experience. I was talking with the staff. I was building a bundle of stuff that I'd been wanting to buy lately anyway. And I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I knew almost every single brand and every single product in the store. I knew their product lineups, I knew the selling points of specific items, I knew whether stuff was over or underpriced based on the usual going rates. So I talked to the employee for probably too long about fountain pens, notebook covers, and upcoming stationery events. Kind of like, those times where most of your friends are not into the same things as you, but then you finally find someone who shows just the slightest amount of interest, and you share everything you know about your hobby. Now, in certain ways, this store visit was cathartic and even rewarding, but I'm calling it the peak for a reason. Because soon after this, my stationery journey hit a wall. I'm going to talk about the specifics of that towards the end of the video, but for now I'm going to say that I was disappointed to realize that in just a few months I had burned through a lot of the excitement of diving into a new hobby, only to wonder what I'd actually gotten out of that experience and whether I really needed to spend so much money along the way. But because this whole experience is still so fresh, because I spent so much time over the past several months looking at stationery, consuming stationery, researching it, talking with people about it, I want to use the next chunk of the video to step back and share some of my observations about the stationery hobby as it stands today. Okay, now I'm about to talk you through some of the most interesting things that I have observed in the stationery community, both good and bad, and I want to be very clear about my intentions with this. These are very much personal observations and, personal thoughts filtered through my own subjective experience. I'm not trying to summarize the entire community or speak for other people. And while I do think there's some useful information here for people who are new to this hobby, this interest, whatever you want to call it, I also think that these observations might be more valuable as like a time capsule. It's something to look back on as this hobby continues to change and evolve. And of course, these observations are tied to my understanding of stationery as a consumption community and my own little mini journey of feeling different ways about it over time. Also, this stuff is open to discussion, so go ahead and share some thoughts in the comments or contact me directly if, like myself, you're not too internet social. Believe it or not, I do not like being on camera. Since this is a channel where I typically talk a lot about marketing, I feel compelled to at least mention the marketing landscape of the stationery community as it is today. Now, based on what I've seen, stationery has plenty of marketing, but almost no direct traditional advertising. Now, to specify, advertising is usually seen as very specific forms of marketing, things like TV commercials, online videos, banner ads, billboards, things like that. And marketing as a term covers a much broader scope of communication channels and techniques. It's the bigger umbrella. Advertising is just a part of it, as I understand it anyway. Now, stationery definitely has plenty of sponsored content online. There are stationery influencers, and there is direct marketing from specialty shops and websites, email lists, things like that. But I have never once seen, for example, a video ad for a certain brand of notebook, planners. There are no stationery billboards. And besides online banner ads for stationery websites, the most that I have personally seen just in browsing around online is those Wes Anderson Mont Blanc ads.
But actually, it's the same slogan as the one we already did before.
Make your mark.
No, the other one.
Let's write.
That's right. Yes.
But that's about it. That's all I've come across. I've come across some web ads based on my cookies and online trackers, but still, it's obviously very limited. And I think it's pretty easy to speculate about why that is, why stationery doesn't have a ton of traditional advertising right now. The most obvious assumption is that stationery brands don't really think it's worth it to spend exorbitant amounts of money on the production and the distribution of traditional advertisements, which I definitely understand. That's my read of things anyway. For one, stationery is still relatively niche, and those smaller enthusiast hobbies offer lots of other marketing opportunities like in-person meetups, conferences, sponsorship deals, and even just real-world use of specialty products that attract attention from other people. And I will be talking about those other forms of marketing in a bit, but at the top, I wanted to make a note of this and explain why I am not including tons of modern-day fountain pen commercials. But no, we have some vintage ones you can look at, I suppose, back when stationery and fountain pens in particular were much more central to everyday life for a lot of people.
Would you expect a ballpoint to write so lightly that you could draw a line on a soft cigarette? With a Schaefer ballpoint, you can write on thin, delicate cigarette paper.
But as for 2025, stationery is not really within the mainstream, not to the money-making degree where they would pump a bunch of money into advertising, so they don't advertise at that kind of broad scale. If I'm wrong about this, please let me know, but that's what I've seen so far. Okay, it's hard to call this an observation exactly, but it is something that I need to at least acknowledge as part of a discussion about contemporary stationery. Stationery, art supplies, these overlapping, interconnected areas have some very clear environmental impacts. And while these impacts are absolutely objective, they can be studied, they can be quantified, how we respond to those and how we adjust our own consumption and use based on those impacts really depends so much on personal perspective. So for example, the vast majority of paper products are of course made from wood, which is, a limited natural resource that when left alone does a really great job of CO2 capture and mitigation, and the paper industry which extends well beyond stationery, of course, is certainly having harmful effects on forests all around the world. We know this already. But of course, paper is also recyclable and biodegradable, making it far less harmful to the environment than basically any plastic product, which of course is one of the world's most common pollutants that harms animals, ecosystems, and it's even, messing up our drinking water. In fact, paper production doesn't even approach the top 10 list of the most polluting industries, based on what I've seen, though it's definitely tied to other highly polluting industries like, energy production and transportation. You can't make and sell and ship paper without global supply chains, without energy running the factories and things like that. So there are ancillary impacts beyond the product materials themselves, but again, relatively okay. But of course, stationery isn't just about paper products. It also represents tons of plastic products as well. Stuff like pens, binders, folders, little tchotchkes for your desk, vinyl stickers. But a plastic product that you use for a long time, instead of throwing away, like a fountain pen, for instance, does have a lesser environmental impact over the long term compared to a typical disposable pen. But then again, many inks and watercolors and paints can also contain harmful compounds, but some don't. For example, these really excellent Molotov markers use food-based ink dyes, and the markers themselves are easily refillable. So there are little lights here. There are little spots of more sustainable ways to engage with stationery and art supplies, but it's spotty. And at a much broader level, I also think that we are experiencing a moment in environmental conservation where a lot of people are feeling justifiably defeated. There are also like climate science leaders who have emphasized that at this point, meaningful change basically has to come from giant companies, world governments, things like that, which makes it pretty tough to suggest that just individuals who already have relatively minor climate impacts should completely stop enjoying their hobbies for the sake of extremely marginal environmental gains. But it does still have a positive impact if you reduce. And to make things even more complicated, I assumed that a lot of digital paperless stationery alternatives, things like, apps, Procreate on iPad, stuff like that those would be inherently more environmentally sustainable because, of course, they're not using up all that physical media. But on second thought, all of our digital devices depend on the energy sector for one, which is, of course, the single biggest source of CO2 emissions on the planet. And many of the components inside those devices have absolutely reprehensible environmental impacts, not to mention abysmal human rights and labor issues. If you want to ruin your day, go ahead and read up on some of that stuff, but I'm guessing you already have. So I think you can see why this is tricky to talk about. On just a personal level, the environmental side of things is definitely another useful reminder for me to moderate my stationery consumption where possible. I do try to avoid plastic products where I can, and I do try to reuse a lot of plastics that I already have. Paper continues to be a pretty tricky area. Lots of recycled paper stocks do exist, but as far as I know, they are almost non-existent among the flagship products from virtually all stationery and art brands. They're pretty marginal at this point. In fact, Toby even mentioned giving that trendy rock-based paper a try with the hopes of finding it more sustainable, and apparently there were some disappointing results.
It is wasteful. And what else would you be doing instead? Would that be more waste? Every time I've tried to confront it in some way, like I got a couple of stone paper sketchbooks up there, which I thought, oh cool, this I didn't end up liking the paper. I was like, maybe it is an ecological alternative, and then you learn it's not.
And because this is such a personal aspect of stationery consumption and use, I'm going to avoid issuing some kind of ultimatum. For one, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I never am. But in general, I do think that you have a great opportunity to decide how much to prioritize sustainability in your journaling or planning or artistic practice.
Helena also explained how smaller stationery businesses are generally better positioned to offer more sustainable options.
Small businesses seems to really be leading this kind of values-driven and values-aligned business practices. Often they might have the flexibility because they don't have pressures, right, to maximize shareholder value. And so sometimes if the founder, the owner, and the employees of the business are aligned with more responsible or environmentally conscious consumption, then they can do things like really analyze their supply chain. They can find responsible suppliers and resources in their manufacturing process. And again, their commitment to sourcing the best and the most aligned suppliers, distributors, manufacturers, and communicating that on their website through their products. I think that's where there's a lot of promise and potential.
And I think it would be really nice if people watching this would like to recommend some sustainable stationery that they've tried themselves and that they've liked. Please share some links. I'll try to throw some things up on the screen. Recommend your favorites and feel free to highlight any manufacturers that are prioritizing sustainability. I think that's a good way to make this video more useful. Another one of my favorite things about stationery as a hobby is that it really seems to be undeniably wholesome. So part of this is pure aesthetics. If you just look around, you browse a stationery site for a while, or visit an actual brick and mortar store. Obviously, cute is the dominant adjective when looking at a lot of stationery, but there's also a lot of sleek and refined, I think. You have some cutting edge style as well as obvious throwbacks to the decades when stationery was far more relevant to general audiences. And the same goes for most stationery content on social media, just cozy vibes all around. And while there are still internal controversies and a certain level of snobbery within stationery, sometimes, as is the case with a lot of enthusiast communities, come to think of it, I have very rarely seen that translate into some kind of aggressive gatekeeping. Generally, stationery as a community is really welcoming. And I should also state really quickly, this is just something I thought when I sat down to record, but it's inherently more accessible than a ton of other consumption communities out there, just because the barrier to entry, there are lots of stationery products for low prices, is what I'm saying. And you can get a lot of enjoyment out of those. You don't have to be buying huge ticket items to feel involved or to get a sense of why people and why you yourself would enjoy this stuff so much. Of course, I think that anyone can tell you this is not a perfect community. Despite these cozy heated blanket vibes, there are some problems that I've seen. There are companies that don't have the best motives. I'll probably avoid discussing them. It just took up too much of the video before. And I do think that the community itself can easily encourage, even at like an ambient level, potentially irresponsible spending. And, stationery, of course, as we just talked about, has pretty obvious environmental impacts. But even so, I think that stationery manages to hold on to its wholesome vibe overall, and that is not just because of those fun, cutesy products. It also has to do with the intended use cases for a lot of this stuff. At the risk of acting overly sentimental about the value of physical materials, I will say that writing or drawing stuff with actual pen and paper is still one of the most mentally healthy things I do.
In particular, my guests commented on the value and enjoyment they derive from the physical act of journaling and or drawing.
I did have a regular journal. I kept it when I was during my 4 years in Washington State as a college student. After several years, there's so much of it and so heavy, and I looked through them, I felt like I wasn't interested in looking at them. They didn't make me enjoy it. So I threw them all away. As I started to try to write comics, I was always having trouble finishing it, and then at some point I just wanted to draw something, And what I felt that I could draw was just draw my own daily experiences. I think one of the first few were like just drawing a scene. It was me pushing my brother into the drain. It was just going back to my 8-year-old self. Those were kind of meaningful, and I like looking at them even if nobody was gonna read them.
Because I think on paper, I find that like I always have to have a notebook in front of me, but I lean on it even more so now than ever before. I think just because I have so many thoughts swirling in my mind at once, just having a quiet space that isn't full of screens and notifications and opportunities for distraction, I feel like I can't function without it.
If we talk about like the thing I look forward to most, it would be being on holiday, somewhere where you have a nice view, you get out your sketchbook and a fountain pen, and then if I'm feeling good or I've got a long time, I also get out some watercolors and a really big brush. Again, I used the word romantic already. That's my romantic vision for what I do. If I could just do that and probably have some nice sandwiches, then I'll be happy, you know?
Journaling specifically has allowed me to lead a more intentional life. Rather than seeing my days just pass by, it's helped me be more deliberate about the actions that I was taking and really reflecting and sometimes critically interrogating on how my actions, my behaviors either led me closer towards or led me away from the type of person I wanted to be and the values that I held.
What I'm coming around to here is that I am not at all surprised that so many people end up using their stationery for things like letter writing, journaling, planning, and lots of other activities that are focused on self-reflection and self-improvement, you know, despite the huge number of digital alternatives that are available to us now. So maybe I'm overstating this, but physical writing, drawing, planning, and journaling represent a form of conscious or unconscious opposition to the digital information pipelines that are very actively shaping human thought right now. Journaling with pen and paper doesn't need to be an act of protest. I understand that sounds like a lot, but I also think that this is another opportunity that I'm excited to see out there. I think it's cool that by using physical materials, you are, at least in a small way, kind of rejecting spending so much time in digital spaces, and I do think there are benefits to that, at least for me. And of course, you know, if you've watched the channel before, you know that I really appreciate any kind of space where I'm safely out of reach of all advertising and, you know, notebooks, sketchbooks, planners, journals. These are spaces, which is another huge advantage of stationery in general. I mean, if you use these objects yourself, then I think you already know what I mean there. And because so much of the stationery community orbits around some form of self-improvement, I just have a lot of admiration for this community as a whole. You know, in a world that is, in many ways, coming apart at the seams or close to it, stationery people are choosing to organize, they're choosing to think, to plan, to communicate with others, and generally just get their together. In my opinion, there are so many worse things that you could be doing. And that's what I mean when I say that stationery is wholesome. This one's a bit of a downer. Artificial scarcity and FOMO are rampant in stationery. Not universal, but very, very common. I'm not aware of any legitimate, consistent shortages in stationery, but unfortunately, many stationery brands excel at generating false scarcity for a wide range of their mass-manufactured products.
A lot of companies, I think of Hobonichi, and I also think of companies like Traveler's Company, they've really leveraged the scarcity of limited edition drops. And that combined with this international community that has flourished on social media, they've received so much more attention, I think so much more sales than they were initially prepared to deal with.
I'm going to give a pass to any small brands and businesses that do limited runs. For example, someone who runs like an Etsy shop for stickers and prints of their own work. They might call a product line limited run just to like add some extra spice to it. But in reality, it's legitimately a limited run, not by choice, but by necessity. It just doesn't make sense to produce a huge amount of a product when you don't know if it's going to sell. What I'm really taking issue with here is when, for example, one of the biggest pen manufacturers on the planet decides to release a limited edition series of ballpoint pens with like minor color differences, or when a planner company, I don't know which one, but some planner company sells out of a certain planner or cover, and they see that lots of their customers would definitely buy that stuff if it was available again, and then they ultimately choose to never produce more, which creates anticipation and frustration around their future product launches. And of course, it also fuels a pretty massive reselling market and scalping and all that stuff. On top of the usual temptations to just impulse buy something that you're not going to be able to get later, I think that buying reflex is spurred on by the fact that lots of limited edition stationery products are relatively affordable, with some major exceptions, I guess. So, a limited edition ballpoint is still just a ballpoint. It's probably not going to be more than $10 or so at MSRP. And while low initial prices are good news on the surface, it also makes it much easier for someone to just go through with the purchase and then maybe go through with another purchase for another limited edition item, and so on and so forth, until you have spent like $100 on stationery that you feel like you shouldn't use because it might be worth more money 30 years from now. I killed a joke. I had a joke written in the script, but I killed it with that delivery, so we're just going to move on. Maybe one day artificial scarcity will be regulated in some form, similar to how planned obsolescence is undergoing greater scrutiny these days. But for the moment, I think it's just up to us as customers to try to resist these incessant attempts to push us into buying stuff we probably would not have bought otherwise. Okay, if you're feeling up to it, let's try something different here. So in another tab or on another device, head over to YouTube, or honestly any, social media site with a lot of video content. Search the word stationery, and then when you get the results, count the number of products visible in just like the first 3 thumbnails combined. So when I did this, when I was writing the script, I counted more than 30 products. I think I have a screenshot if you want to double check. It was on YouTube also. Obviously, the results will vary, but I'm going to guess that when you do this exercise, you're going to see at least 8 products across the first 3 thumbnails. Just a guess. Feel free to share your results in the comments. And honestly, even 8 is kind of a lot, especially when we consider that modern stationery thrives on immediate visual appeal. I was talking about that a bit earlier, meaning that just showing a product can have some form of marketing function. So even if a thumbnail is just setting up a video that's like being really negative about a certain brand, if the products themselves look appealing in that thumbnail, someone could see it, like the look of the products, and then go looking for them without ever hearing the video's criticism. And I think a lot of creators could tell you the vast majority of people do not click through on a thumbnail. So like the majority of people seeing that thumbnail will never actually hear what you have to say. But the fact that that scenario is even possible and possibly likely is really fascinating to me. And those sorts of split-second impressions of dozens of different posts have become absolutely foundational to the way that platforms like YouTube operate now. YouTube in particular has encouraged this kind of thing, making thumbnails alone absolutely integral to a video's success. And the natural result of that standard, of that example, is for channels to make their thumbnails as visually appealing as possible. We've seen this in action for many years, so it makes a lot of sense for creators to put visually appealing stationery products in their thumbnails if that's what they're covering. Now, according to the definition that I just made up, one of the key traits of a consumption community is that participation in the community basically guarantees frequent exposure to related products that are available for purchase. I also see this as like a collective issue. It's not about whether individual brands, individual channels, or individual customers offer exceptions to these norms. It's more about the entire landscape of a community and its conduits, its means of communication. Many stationery events and festivals are really just big marketplaces, essentially. Even attendance for these kind of events is also transactional. You gotta pay even to get in for the opportunity to maybe buy stuff. So none of this means that stationery tube, stationery social media is bad. None of this means that stationery festivals are bad. I'm just trying to illustrate what I think is a pretty important point. In a consumption community, you have to make a concerted effort to find some kind of space or even some kind of conversation that does not revolve entirely around buying stuff. And I wanted to bring this up because such a high level of exposure to products and purchases represents a very legitimate concern for people who, for whatever reason, want to avoid feeling tempted to buy things. and something that I like to bring up as much as I can is that, even if you yourself are really, really good at resisting these temptations, I can guarantee that there are plenty of other people, like me, for example, who really struggle with that. And again, this issue is much larger than any one channel or any online forum or event. Even if you're extremely careful about which spaces you occupy, prioritizing spaces that aren't as consumption forward as others, chances are pretty high that you're still going to see a lot of products and purchasing opportunities, and that's just kind of a drag. I do think it's a negative. And I honestly don't know if we can really expect this to ever change in a big way, and that's probably not the question I should be asking anyway. Maybe the more important question here is what else can be found within the community? Which aspects have little or nothing to do with consumption? Which spaces and opportunities and interactions offer deeper levels of value and meaning? I'm saving a lot of positivity for the big finale, but I can say right now that the stationery hobby has many, many of these non-transactional elements, and they're really useful, they're really valuable. Not only that, but I also happen to feel that Stationery Tube features some really impressive discussion about this exact topic, and that's a really healthy thing to have in a consumption community. But zooming in, I think that we've also seen a notable uptick in soul-searching videos in the wake of a particular stationery company's arguable fall from grace. This is a wonderful thing, seeing this discussion, seeing this criticism. For the moment, seeing both the product parade and the purchase skepticism within the stationery community is a really great sign. Something that's really wonderful about niche hobbies in general is that they're often sustained by networks of small businesses that really help to distribute and introduce specialty products that probably aren't available from a lot of bigger retailers. Now, I'm happy to report that there are quite a few independent stationery stores out there, all around the world, by the way. If you live anywhere near a medium to large city, I would say, there's a pretty good chance that there's a stationery store in your area. And even if you want to order from them online, I think it's a really good thing to order from stores that are relatively close by, just to lessen the shipping impact. And also you don't have to wait as long for the package, which is kind of nice. I also take it as a good sign when, I'm searching around online and I very easily come across overseas stores. Prior to August 29th, at least, ordering from overseas stores was actually a pretty good option for customers like me here in the US. Obviously, that's kind of borked now. In fact, tariffs have been pricing up basically all stationery, but I'm trying to avoid getting to that in this video. However, one of the realities of buying from, a lot of highly specialized small businesses rather than buying from big multinationals is that you're going to be spending some real money. So in most cases, independent stores, they buy the stuff from the company or from a distributor, they import the things, and then they'll add some kind of markup to compensate for those costs and just to make their margin, So you're probably not going to be seeing a lot of like bottom of the barrel wholesale prices here. And while that's definitely not good news for bargain hunters, a side benefit is that specific products are likely to cost roughly the same across different stores, which means that you may as well order from the store that you like the best or the one that's closest to you. Unfortunately, I have noticed that the bigger online retailers, take a guess which ones I'm thinking of here, have kind of caught wind of the more popular stationery products and the trends in the last few years. Certain stationery brands also seem to be selling directly on these sites, or these marketplaces, we should call them, as well. Now, of course, I think a lot of us know that sites like Amazon have kind of mastered the practice of tricking people into thinking that they're getting some kind of a deal, even when they're really not. And of course, many retailers, especially online retailers, use pricing engines that may charge you individually a higher price after you've given some sort of evidence that you're interested in a particular product or that you're willing to spend more on a certain thing. So a lot of times, even something that looks like a lower price for high quality stationery is actually just an illusion. It's just a trick. But unfortunately, sometimes the big soul crushing sites actually do offer significantly better prices for the exact same products. And those are the times when my convictions are really tested. I'm not going to show like screenshots of direct price comparisons for the stuff I'm about to talk about. That feels like it would be needlessly cruel to the smaller stores, but I have seen certain items that cost exactly the same price on every single stationery site that I visited, but a lot less on the big box sites, like much less. My all-time favorite sketchbook is about $18 at all of the stationery stores, but it is consistently $11 on one of the bad sites. And since I've been going through about one of those sketchbooks every single month, it's actually a pretty tough choice to make, especially since a lot of the independent shops, understandably so, have relatively high free shipping thresholds. And those thresholds often encourage unnecessary spending on purpose. That's kind of the point, other than making it financially feasible for the store to offer free shipping. Now, of course, the really good stationery shops have exquisite taste in their product selection, and that's a huge advantage. But the fact is, if the big sites chose to take enough of an interest, they could offer basically the same stuff at much lower prices, and that's kind of terrifying. And we already know that this is not a fair fight. People and businesses that are already in positions of power continue to get more and more powerful, mostly through just momentum as well as, and the reality is, a little shop, as of right now, cannot offer free and fast shipping, and those price markups are basically how they stay in business. So it's really sad when it's much more convenient and economic to buy from a site that would probably just get along fine without you. And I know this is depressing, but I'm going to swing it around to a positive point. I think that small independent stationery shops have a fantastic opportunity to distinguish themselves in a really competitive field. And that opportunity is the integration of local community-focused products and services. And of course, that's not my idea. It's just something that I've seen in action from some of my absolute favorite stationery stores, and I think it's perfect. There are almost no downsides. In just the last few months, Yoseka Stationery over in Brooklyn has established its own event space, which is especially impressive for, anything in Brooklyn. And my local store, Paper Plant Co., does a really fantastic job of working with local artists, businesses, and organizations. In fact, their website lets you sort products based on specific artists, though I kind of feel like they should add a view all option somewhere, because right now I have to visit each individual artist page just to see what their stuff looks like. Some of the pages are empty sometimes, so it could be optimized. But I think it's great it's there. Also, Paper Plant Co. did not respond to my request for an interview. Something else Paper Plant Co. has done recently is host their very own stationery-based event, festival, right here in downtown LA. And that means it's time for a quick field trip. I'm sure many other people are going to be making videos about this event, and I don't want to make you feel bad for not being able to go. It was extremely crowded. Feels kind of like it was oversold, literally in terms of the number of tickets. And I had that realization 20 minutes into waiting to buy something at a specific booth that wasn't even all that busy compared to some of the other booths. I was like, I could just look up each vendor and order from them online, and this would probably be a lot less painful. That said, it was actually still a very comfortable event in terms of how everyone was acting. It was really pleasant. I briefly chatted with some people here and there, which is extremely rare for me. A positive experience for sure. At the same time, as stationery people, I think many of us also enjoy being back home again. And just because I don't think this is going to come up again, I want to mention stores like Ooga Booga, more of a bookstore than a stationery store, but still a shining example of building ties with local creatives and offering items that you literally won't be able to find anywhere else. That's a huge advantage. And for the store owners out there, regardless of where your shop is located, I can guarantee that there are local artists who really wish that there were more ways to get their work seen and to generate sales. Your shop can offer that. And on top of being a positive move for the community overall, this also means that you can offer specific stuff that other small stationery stores around the country just can't. Plus, buyers then get to feel good about supporting the local scene. Meanwhile, big retailers tend to do a really terrible job of offering much of anything creative. Etsy doesn't count, by the way, that's like a marketplace. You know, for example, just hop on Amazon and try to find like an art print that's halfway interesting or unique or that you couldn't find a million other places. There are so many product categories where small businesses just kind of lost out a long time ago, where it's basically always in the customer's best interest to buy from whichever place has the best deal, and that's generally one of the big box stores. The fact that stationery still gets to exist as a more diverse business landscape is already really exciting and impressive. And it sure seems like stationery people are just kind of overall more conscientious of where they buy stuff from in the first place. So much so that, like, if hypothetically private equity was to start scooping up stationery brands and doing what they normally do, which is, you know, cutting costs and quality to create the impression of major growth, setting themselves up to, you know, sell it to someone else for a high price, my guess is that stationery customers would voice their concerns, to put it lightly, probably in the form of elegant calligraphy. I'm going to move on now because I'm not really a business-minded person, if you couldn't tell. But from a customer's point of view, the bottom line here is that there's plenty of reason to feel energized about stationery retail, especially with small businesses, and that's a pretty rare thing in 2025. I really want to close out this section with a more positive observation, and I think I've got a good one for you. So, longtime NBI viewers will already know that I'm not a minimalist, I'm not an off-gridder. obviously. I don't try to encourage people to get rid of all their stuff and never buy anything again. I like buying stuff a lot. And unfortunately, I disagree with the idea that money can't buy happiness. Don't worry, just in small ways. But, you know, on top of preventing debt and financial stress that shortens life expectancy, money is pretty great for delivering small doses of motivation and joy, basically whenever. Responsible spending can be an effective way to make yourself just feel a bit better and to ease the baseline discomfort of being a person.
When I buy something, it's just like buying a new clothes. When you buy a new shirt or buy a new pen, I get to experience life in a different way, and I like that newness.
And as I've said before, marketing actually gets in the way of the joys of consumption, which is a contradiction that I think many marketers don't seem to acknowledge or understand in any way. Now, I'm setting all this up because from person to person, the amount of joy and satisfaction that results from specific purchases is going to vary drastically based on what they like, you know, what they're buying, all that stuff. And with that in mind, the best thing that I can say about stationery is that I think it gives me more joy and satisfaction over a longer period of time than almost anything else I buy.
What I find is that for me, it's satisfying, not because of the dopamine hit that I get when a beautiful parcel arrives at my doorstep and I unwrap the gorgeous notebook or the gorgeous pen, but it's rewarding because of the time that I get to spend filling up that journal, of actually writing my thoughts, feelings, aspirations, even my to-do list. All of that is in service of creating more joy and more calm in my life. So in that sense, to me, stationery purchases can have more long-term reward than other purchases.
If I'm having a tough day at work, sometimes I'll grab one of my favorite pens to doodle with. Here's one right here. Here it is, I found it. There's a guy in North Carolina selling these for like $30. It's crazy. And of course, I really love coming back to where it all started for me, which is just writing down some thoughts or doing some automatic drawing, not really thinking about anything at all. Obviously, this doesn't mean that stationery is the answer to all of life's problems. It is not a substitute for actually taking care of myself or improving my mental health or, you know, any of the other things that actually make people feel better. But I do find it surprising, in a good way, that getting and using stationery has been so much more pleasing than most of the other stuff that I've bought throughout the years. And whether I like it or not, I can't just ignore that kind of joy. So you might remember that much earlier in the video, I talked about how I returned to stationery specifically because I was just having a nice time drawing and coloring stuff. Now, in retrospect, did my drawing practice benefit from my exploration of supplies and specialized purchases? I think that it did. But, and this is the wall I alluded to earlier, on one particular evening a month or two ago, I was just kind of futzing around right here at this desk, actually, and I think I was working with a brush pen that I had recently gotten, and it wasn't working the way I wanted it to. I was in full workbench mode, you know, like I had the work light on, I had my loop, I had my sharpest tweezers. I was really in it. And I do admit that getting really involved in a project like that, in the minutia, can be fun in its own right. I do like taking stuff apart. I've built a couple of Gundams. I've ruined some small electronic devices. But this particular evening, I really wasn't having fun. And suddenly, I had this painful realization. Oh, I could be drawing right now. And this nonsense, the messing around with the gear, was actively getting in the way of doing the thing that had motivated me to get any of this stuff in the first place. This specific pen that I was working on, it's not like it was my last resort. I didn't need it to make my drawings. but I felt like I needed to fix it just to justify the purchase. And that moment of frustration and temporary obsession, I think, was symptomatic of my broader obsession with the consumption side of stationery as opposed to use. Watching stationery videos, combing through stationery websites, and tracking stationery orders several times a day, these things were actively taking time away from using the stuff that I already had. And my enjoyment of all of those consumption-focused activities I just mentioned, the enjoyment wasn't fake, like researching products and shopping around and ordering things, waiting for them to arrive. These aspects of participating in a consumption community definitely do provide their own sense of satisfaction. I would also argue they offer a kind of progression and achievement, even if it's really just imagined. But there's definitely a limit to those advantages, and there definitely was for me.
Buying too much stuff is no fun. And having to clear my desks and stuff around my room all the time, it just takes up a lot of time and energy. I find that having less, it's actually better because it helps me to focus and get to my work quicker and do what I need to do.
I'm finding it hard to present this idea in a way that doesn't feel like really cheesy and simplistic, but I don't know, maybe simplistic is a good thing in this situation, because I do want to remind anyone in a similar situation that you really don't need to buy that thing that you've been looking at lately. Even if your favorite hobby is tied to a consumption community, you don't need to buy the best stuff to keep doing it, and there's a chance you don't need to keep buying anything at all to keep doing it. And you definitely don't need to check out the trendy new thing for yourself. What made my own experience with stationery especially frustrating has nothing to do at all with stationery shops. It has nothing to do with the stationery creators and influencers who are just all going about their business. The worst part, I think, is that I knew better. I have been down this road before, and I already knew how it was going to end up. And that realization I just talked about, I've had pretty much that same realization plenty of times before. It's not a new thing for me. I think I could have checked myself much sooner. There are still a lot of positives about engaging with this community in particular, as I've talked about a whole lot so far, especially when that engagement is unrelated to spending. I've never felt the need to cut myself off from stationery content or stationery websites. But given my situation and my tendencies, I do need to be conscious of FOMO and impulse buying.
I've had to be kind to myself and not set really harsh rules, because I think when I do try to set really strict rules for myself, I tend to not enjoy myself, and then I just end up in a shame spiral for myself. So I don't really set hard rules, but I do set up guidelines for myself. I do try to be mindful with the way that I make purchase decisions. And I do try always to slow down, because I know that my tendency is to dive in head first and just indulge.
So I grew up very poor, and buying stationery goodies was seen as so frivolous and such a waste. I have a lot of internalized shame around even desiring things. But it didn't matter if I was making $40,000 a year or $150,000 a year. I always felt poor. And because of that, I've spent most of my life struggling with allowing myself to spend. I think I would like to find a more compassionate and healthy balance between not letting myself have any joy or fun, but also not swing the pendulum so far the other way that I end up justifying overconsumption to myself.
And if we want to get really serious here for just a second, I think that my dumbest and my worst stationery purchases were probably fueled by things like a desire for motivation, a need to improve my mood in the short term, or maybe just wanting something to look forward to when I'm staring down like months or even years of demeaning work days and weekends that feel 5 minutes long. And I know that I'm not alone in this, of course. We all have reasons for wanting to feel better. And there are very legitimate reasons to feel worried and insecure and tired. And even just keeping up with day-to-day survival can make it difficult to truly process any of the stuff that we're going through. And from that perspective, something that helps you cope is a net positive, but only up to a point. Trying to balance all this stuff kind of sucks, to say the least. I don't think that like hardcore no-buys are the answer for me. And I also don't think that I need to stay away from all consumption communities forever. And while I'm definitely not here to make your choices for you, if you're looking for some kind of friendly advice, I guess it would be to know your own boundaries. Just pay attention to when something has crossed a line for you personally, whether that's on the part of someone else or something that you're doing that is start to bother and upset you in a way where you feel like it needs to be addressed. But I want to acknowledge here that even the most wholesome hobbies, like this one, when combined with the highly corporatized internet, can quickly threaten your bank account. And from a certain point of view, that's kind of what the internet is designed to do overall. Despite the FOMO, despite the temptations, there is so much to be gained from pursuing your passions and connecting with others through those passions. And as you explore, just try to trust yourself. I know it sounds corny, but we're going with it.
If you can go through social media and be in a positive space rather than a comparative space, I learned a lot from looking at other artists' work. When I could get myself into a space of going, I like looking at that and I think I'd like to do it, or I like looking at that, but I recognize there's no way I would want to do that.
And just in case you're thinking about getting into stationery in particular, I know I'm biased, but I really do think it's worth trying on your own terms, of course. Everyone that I have interacted with in the stationery community has been welcoming, they've been considerate, and just really eager to talk about stationery. I'd kind of forgotten how much fun it is just to talk about things you like.
Please don't include this if it sounds really cliche, but I think it seems like it's about connection to me. And there is an element of community or connection when it comes to maybe we have similar items, so then we feel really connected. But I think at the heart of it, it's really about connecting on this love for this shared interest that we have.
And there's something about the stationery community with people who love analog planning and systems, for people who like being introspective and reflective, where I do find it restores a lot of my lost faith in humanity when I engage with the stationery community.
Even outside of stationery, getting involved in the communal aspects of whatever your interests happen to be is a move worth making. And you know what? Maybe this is the sign that you've been waiting for. Now is definitely the time. You've got future friends out there just waiting to have late night Discord discussions about your favorite things. Or maybe they'd prefer to write letters. Wow, thank you so much for joining me for yet another video that probably took too long for me to produce. Obviously, this is a pretty big project for me and for the channel, and I hope you like it. I hope people are not too mad at me, especially stationary people. Obviously, it was not my intention here at all to go after, any individuals, or really even go after the community as a whole. I consider myself a member of that community. If you haven't been able to tell, I've really, really enjoyed the experience of getting back into stationery and certain types of art supplies and stuff. So yes, this is something I really, really just needed to do. And I'm so glad that all of you gave me the time to do it, to actually put this together. And obviously thanks once again to my wonderful special guests. I specifically contacted these people because I was, a fan of their work. Each of them was really, really wonderful to talk with. And yes, I should probably stop talking. As you may or may not know, I don't do YouTube monetization here. You can donate to the channel through Ko-fi, link in the description. But I bring that up because YouTube, since I'm not doing monetization on YouTube, they are not interested, the algorithms are not interested in promoting this stuff. So if you feel strongly about this video in a positive or negative way, please feel free to share it around, because that is the only way we end up getting any kind of, views on this stuff. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Please take care.